if the churches had collectively said no to closing their doors, there's absolutely nothing the state could have or would have done. When you have bishops thinking primarily in terms of liability and not in terms of the pastoral care of their flock, then they've abandoned their apostolic mandate and their mission. I would say that to their face. I have said it to their face on more than one occasion.
Welcome to the EDIFY podcast, where our guests share practical wisdom on living our faith in public. I'm Mary Fiorito. Thank you for joining us today. Today on the EDIFY podcast, we are joined by Dr. Aaron Kheriaty. He is a psychiatrist and the former medical school professor at UC Irvine, and he was fired for questioning COVID measures at his institution during the pandemic. You can learn more about his story in our previous EDIFY podcast episode and the animated video, which of course will be linked in the show notes below. Welcome back, Aaron, to the EDIFY podcast. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Mary. Great to be with you again.
Thank you. Well, today is St. Patrick's Day. In addition to being the 3-year anniversary of the 15 days to slow the spread. And since President Biden still hasn't ended the COVID public emergency, I believe that today is the 1097th day to slow the spread, but who's counting, right? So I want to jump right into it. Obviously, during a pandemic, you'd expect some mental health outcomes that were negative. But the duration and magnitude of these are really frightening when you look at it. Can you speak a little bit about, just as you're in your position as a psychiatrist, what you've seen personally and then even anecdotally would be really interesting to our listeners?
Yeah, so thanks for asking about this. It is really important. It's received too little media attention. In fact, my first foray into publicly criticizing COVID pandemic policy happened back in 2020. I think it was August or September of 2020, I published a piece called The Other Pandemic in Public Discourse. And there I was trying to draw attention to the mental health crisis that was caused not by the virus, not by coronavirus, as many people or places were reporting, but by our policy response to the virus. The harms, the mental health harms, were not caused by COVID or the novel coronavirus. They were caused by lockdowns and school closures and social distancing policies and mask mandates. So back in 2020, when I first wrote about this, we already had CDC data from a study that was done in June of 2020 showing a massive spike in mental health problems among Americans. There was a similar study done in Britain around the same time that showed basically the same results. But in the month of June 2020, after several months of lockdowns and school closures that year, we saw a tripling of depressive disorders. We saw a quadrupling in the rate of anxiety disorders as compared to previous, 5-year averages. We saw a very concerning number of people reporting that at some time in the last month, not over their entire lifetimes, but in the month of June 2020 alone, 11% of Americans, 1 in 10 Americans, had reported serious suicidal ideation, seriously contemplating taking their own life. And if you break that down by age bracket, if you look at young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds, college-age Americans, that number was 24%. 1 in 4 college-age Americans in the month of June 2020 seriously considered ending his or her own life. And now we have this report out from the CDC, basically describing these findings and showing that the damage done from lockdowns and school closures continues to be felt, especially among young Americans, especially among young women, even after those specific policies have been rolled back. And I've been arguing that the effects of lockdowns and school closures on child development and on child and adolescent mental health are going to be actually felt for decades, because you can't just interrupt someone's crucial stage of development, social development in the case of adolescents, cognitive and language development in the case of preschool or grade school age children with things like school closures or mask mandates, without that having potentially lifelong implications and lifelong effects. So some of those effects we're seeing right away in the forms of these mental health problems. Also, I didn't mention huge rise in alcohol abuse, huge rise in drug abuse and drug overdose. So we could talk about prior to the pandemic, 2017, 2018, there was public health attention on two issues. One was the problem of widespread loneliness and the impact of loneliness on mental health. So the Surgeon General Vivek Murthy described the effects of loneliness as an epidemic and said that they were as harmful to our physical and mental health as things like smoking. So if you look back a few decades ago in the 1980s, a simple sort of survey metric question for loneliness is, do you have anyone in your life with whom you can discuss important matters? And when you asked that question back in the 1980s, 20% of Americans said, no, I have no person, no family member, friend, colleague at work with whom I can discuss important personal matters. That survey done in 2018 showed 40% of Americans, 2 in 5 Americans, saying, no, I don't have anyone in my life with whom I can discuss important matters. So we had this epidemic of loneliness. We also had an epidemic of what are called deaths of despair. So Ann Case and Angus Deaton wrote a landmark study about this in 2018. They published a book the following year called Deaths of Despair. And these are Nobel Prize winning social science researchers. And deaths of despair are deaths by suicide, drug related illnesses, drug overdose, really, and alcohol related illnesses like liver cirrhosis and that sort of thing. And this was a serious crisis even before the pandemic. So drug overdose deaths in the year 1999 were 20,000 a year in the United States. That went up to 70,000 per year in 2018. So a huge rise in deaths by drug overdose. The opioid crisis, the fentanyl crisis was by far the deadliest drug crisis in US history. Then the pandemic comes along and we locked the schools, we locked people down, we closed the schools, we separated people from their social connections and from their family. And what happened? We poured gasoline on that already existing fire of suicide and drug-related deaths. So drug-related deaths went from 70,000 in 2018 to 100,000 in 2021, in just 2-3 years. Same thing happened to alcohol-related illnesses. That was about 70,000. That went to 99,000 during the lockdowns and school closures. So we had a massive problem with mental health already. We had seen suicide also on the rise between 1999 and 2018. There was a very significant increase in suicide, especially pronounced among young people, a tripling of rates of suicide among girls age 8 to 11. When I was in training 20 years ago, prepubescent suicide was exceptionally rare in the United States. You got a significant spike in suicide after puberty, but it was almost unheard of to have children committing suicide prior to puberty, prior to adolescent stage of development. And now, tragically and sort of horrifyingly, it's not so uncommon.
Yeah. Well, let's just go back to those prepubescent and then maybe early adolescent students who were locked in their homes, presumably with their parents and their laptops. How is the experience that they went through different from, say, the average homeschooling family? Because I think what a lot of people kind of assumed will be this will just like the families who homeschool, and this will actually maybe be better for my child and we'll spend more quality time together. Where did those two paths diverge if they were ever on the same track to begin with, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of important differences. Homeschool families tend, just statistically speaking, to be larger. So the children have more siblings at home with them that they can interact with socially. Most homeschooling families have a social network of other homeschooling families that they can get together with. They've already created a sort of system of mutual support and reinforcement and opportunities for socialization. And some of those things could still be maintained during lockdowns and school closures. Whereas families, particularly families that had children in public schools, who couldn't afford private schools prior to the pandemic, oftentimes had two parents working, first of all. So with homeschooling families, usually there's at least one of the parents, usually the mother, but could be the father, dedicated almost full time to making the homeschooling project work. So you have a parent who's home with the kids, knows how to monitor their progress in school, knows how to tutor and sort of coach and help them along. And that simply wasn't possible for many families during the pandemic. So you had a lot of kids who were logging into public schooling via Zoom that were basically latchkey kids. They were home alone. Both parents were having to work, professionally. So
yeah, the parents weren't actually
home, and
right.
And if they were home, many of them were trying to work from home to maintain their jobs from home. They had a hard time sort of carving out time to keep an eye on what the kids were doing. And when they did, they weren't used to having to be a tutor. It was sort of thrust upon them all of the sudden without any preparation, without a social network of other parents that they knew, that they collaborated with, who could, talk to them about, here's some good resources and here's what I find helpful for my kids. And many parents figured it out. Right. I think especially parents that had more resources and had more means, they said, okay, well, we can afford to have one of us dial back on professional work to devote more time to helping the kids at school. And they kept a close eye on things and but in LA Unified School District, for example, up the street from me, on any given day, there was a quarter to a third of students who literally never logged on to the online schooling. Not that they logged on and spaced out, not that they didn't do their homework, not that, that they literally had zero contact with the school on a typical day. I mean, this is disastrous. As far as I'm concerned, this was a form of cognitive and emotional child abuse. I don't think that's too strong a term for it. It was a serious form of abandoning children. And of course, as usually happens with bad policies, it's the poor and the working class that are disproportionately harmed by these things, whereas the middle class, upper class can usually access resources that can somewhat cushion the blow and minimize some of the harms of bad public policies. But people who have fewer resources are much more vulnerable. And that's exactly what we saw happening during the pandemic, is that time and again, the poor and working class were disproportionately harmed by our literally insane public health policies.
Well, and then so many of those children are at or below the poverty line, and so they qualify for free federally funded meals at school.
That's right.
In many schools in the city in Chicago, children rely not just for lunch on school, for all three meals, disrupted the nutritional care that a lot of these families depended upon to feed their children.
No, that's exactly right. Again, I can't think of another word for it other than this is a form of child abuse.
Yeah. Child abuse perpetrated by the state, right?
Absolutely. No, it's almost too horrifying to contemplate those kinds of harms.
Could you speak a little bit, too, about children with either developmental disabilities or intellectual delays? Have there been any studies on how the lockdowns in the public schools affected those kids?
Absolutely. This was one of the first early signals to me that we were barreling down a disastrous path with lockdown. So after the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, round about week 3, 4, 5 of lockdowns here in California, I started getting frantic calls and emails from parents of developmentally or cognitively disabled children. And very often these children who have a lot of needs, these are enormous parenting challenges, had gotten into a rhythm where they had sufficient social support from a day program or from a special school that was geared specifically toward their needs, They had a routine and a predictable rhythm of home life and social interaction and school life. And for children with these kinds of disabilities, very often routine and predictability is one of the key things that helps them maintain stability. But again, the most vulnerable people are always the first canary in the coal mine. And after a month of lockdowns, these parents were in crisis because their children were in crisis. They're cognitively disabled. Children were becoming agitated at home because of the lack of the disruption to their routine, the lack of social and emotional support outside the home. The parents didn't have access to the typical resources that made it possible for them to raise their child at home. And they were just beside themselves. These are extremely unstable sorts of situations. And I was horrified that nobody back in 2020, by April of 2020, nobody was paying attention to these people. They were entirely abandoned, never mentioned.
If you want to hear more about the new EDIFY podcasts and videos, please follow us on social media. Just follow the links in the show notes to join the conversation with us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and of course, YouTube. I do want to ask a very provocative column written by two well-respected scientists, physicians, Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya, in the New York Post last month, where they talk about the space shuttle Challenger. When it exploded in 1986, Congress commissioned an independent panel of experts that was bipartisan, and it made real headway into discovering why it was that the Challenger blew up. And they argue that the American people deserve a similar bipartisan, scientifically minded COVID-19 commission so that this public health disaster of the past 3 years is not repeated. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
I completely agree. Jay and Martin are friends and colleagues of mine. We've worked together on several of these public health policy issues. We're co-plaintiffs on a case called Missouri v. Biden, challenging federal censorship. So I'm very familiar with their work, and I agree with them 100% that we need an independent bipartisan commission to look at what happened during the pandemic, look at our policy response to the pandemic, take stock of the benefits and harms of various policies, and ask some really hard questions. I don't know that we have the political appetite for that yet. There's been some movement in that direction with the House of Representatives, some of it probably sincere, some of it maybe political grandstanding or theatrics. But I think we absolutely need such a commission. Our own public health agencies are incapable of doing that work because it would require a self-critique that they're loath to engage in. Also, many of those agencies, as I argue in my book, are severely compromised by various conflicts of interest, especially with financial conflicts of interest with the pharmaceutical companies. So, yeah, this has to be done outside of the public health apparatus that elected those policies, put those policies and enforced those policies in the first place. And, I think the American people deserve that. And I think our children and future generations need that in order to avoid repeating some of the mistakes that we made over the last 3 years.
Well, you look at the way some Americans now are speaking of government agencies that they no longer trust. I mean, whether it's the FBI or whether it's the Centers for Disease Control, it's unfortunately promoted a lot of suspicion and, some really crazy conspiracy theories, but some other theories that it turns out the American people, their gut instincts on things were actually quite correct.
That's right.
Well, let's switch over now to the church. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, as this is a Catholic podcast, was particularly the Catholic Church in the United States' response. We were very, very quick to lock down and very, very slow to open up. If you could, go back to 2020, knowing all you know now, how would you advise the bishops on how to proceed under the circumstances that we were facing at the time?
Mm-hmm. So this is the same advice I would have given them back in 2020. I haven't changed my mind in that regard. And right out of the gate, when states or counties or cities proposed locking down and closing the door of churches, the first thing that the bishops should have said collectively, the bishops of California and my own home state should have collectively gotten together and said, we as bishops have the authority over our churches and over our parishes, and we hold the keys to the doors of the church. The state does not. And this country guarantees the free exercise of religion. And we care about public health. So we will certainly listen to the advice of the California Department of Public Health or the county public health agency or what have you. And based on that advice, we may choose to lock the doors of our church for a limited period of time. But that decision will be up to us. And we'll decide when to reopen them. And the state has basically no authority over that. And if the churches had collectively said no to closing their doors, there's absolutely nothing the state could have or would have done. I mean,
Well, even under emergency orders?
Even under emergency orders, the state has no authority, as far as I'm concerned, to close the door of churches. Now, of course, the lawyers are always skittish, so it wasn't even actually that the bishops were listening to public health authorities. The bishops were listening to lawyers who said, well, look, if everyone else is doing it and we don't do it, then we might be blamed if someone goes to church and catches COVID. I mean, the idea that an institution or an individual should be responsible for someone catching a highly contagious respiratory virus is insane. But that notion of, the lawyer risk management perspective on this drove a kind of crazy arms race in terms of public policy. Who can lock down harder? Who can put more insane social distancing measures in place? Because we want to be doing the most stringent thing possible, because that's what will keep us safest from liability, right? And when you have bishops thinking primarily in terms of liability and not in terms of the pastoral care of their flock, then they've abandoned their apostolic mandate and their mission. I would say that to their face. I have said it to their face on more than one occasion.
It's a hard truth. And I think, sharing the truth in love is something that, actually we're bound to as lay people. I know that there were some bishops, some ordinaries, who literally pulled the faculties of priests, like for going to the hospital to baptize a baby or to baptize a baby privately because, the family had particular circumstances that warranted an immediate baptism and or for going to give people last rites. And there were Catholic hospitals that shamefully wouldn't allow that.
One wonders where Dante would have placed those bishops, which circle of hell. I mean, I think this is another issue that the bishops should have stood up for. If you look at the history of the church, if you look at the plague in Milan, for example, that's chronicled in Massoni's novel, The Betrothed, with Pope Francis refers frequently to this novel, actually, is one of his favorite books. The church has a history of administering to the sick during epidemics, even at some degree of risk to the priests. The church typically doesn't force priests to minister to the sick during epidemics, but it permits it. And those heroic priests who are willing to do it, even at the risk of contagion, are held up as paragons of virtue. There were plenty of priests.
A lot of canonized saints, right?
Yeah, that's right. Many priests I know personally who would have been happy to take the risk of going to hospitals to administer to the sick. And the fact that the church stood back passively as hospitals closed their doors to Catholic chaplains is something that people are going to have to answer for at the last judgment, because denying the sacraments to a dying person.
It's extraordinary.
I don't know. What can you say about that? When someone was willing to do it, and I had priests putting together very thoughtful protocols. Gear up, get trained in all the hospital PPE, whatever I need to do, and all for a virus that didn't harm people under the age of 65. It's crazy.
there were so many people that back in the day, you were one of them, unfortunately, that got canceled, or they lost their jobs. They alienated their friends. They alienated their family members, all of whom now are being proved right on a number of the things
That's right.
that they had claimed, right? So first of all, natural immunity being looked down upon or not seen as credible.
That's right. I mean, I lost my job over that issue. But yeah, the recent Lancet paper on natural immunity, suddenly it's news, right? But there were 150 studies on natural immunity for COVID when I filed my lawsuit almost 2 years ago against the university. There was plenty of documentation back then. Of course, there's even more now showing that natural immunity is superior to vaccine immunity for COVID. The Cochrane review that was recently published, this is the gold standard of evidence. It's considered to be the gold standard of evidence in medicine on various issues. And the
Cochrane review, where is that based?
It's based out of the UK, actually. Yeah, it's an independent group in the UK, and even they have been subject to occasional conflicts of interest and so forth. But the at least the medical establishment claims that this is the gold standard. This is who we look to. Their recent review on masks confirmed what we already knew about masks. 15 randomized controlled trials prior to the pandemic on masks for respiratory virus, all of them negative, no efficacy. And now this Cochrane review looking at 78 randomized controlled trials for masks, showing that masks don't work. Oh, what about N95 masks? Nope, not even N95 masks are effective. People don't understand, you can't wear an N95 all day long at work. You might be able to wear it for 20 minutes when you go in to see a patient in an isolation room in a hospital, right? But try to breathe in an N95 for 8 hours straight. You're going to do damage to your lungs. You're going to do damage to your neurological system because you're rebreathing too much CO2. N95s are harmful if they're worn for prolonged periods of time. I mean, cloth masks and surgical masks are also harmful if they're worn for long periods of time. But N95s are much worse. You can't use them in a community setting.
There was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times just a month ago, I think February 21st, where the author notes, mask mandates were a fool's errand from the start. They may have created a false sense of safety and thus permission to resume semi-normal life, but they did almost nothing to advance safety itself. And
you know what? Some of the public health authorities admitted that when they first started recommending mask mandates. If you look at the WHO's mask mandate kind of recommendations early on, one of the reasons that they give for mandating masks is, as you said, to make people feel a little more safe. So it was sort of psychological. This is like a talisman or some amulet that you wear to ward off the evil viral spirits. But also, it's a visible sign of compliance with other public health directives. They literally said that.
So it was like a giant placebo? Is that what it was? It was a giant placebo for the population?
I mean, Fauci sort of he sort of hinted at this early on as well, because, he knew that masks didn't work. But so everyone was terrified. We had the myth of asymptomatic spread that was pushed also by the WHO. No scientific evidence that asymptomatic spread was a driver of the pandemic. But this myth that anyone, even if they weren't symptomatic, even if they looked healthy, was a potential threat to my existence, right? That's terrifying. People can't live under those circumstances. So what do? Well, we give them something that they can do, however trivial or whatever. And the masks are good because other people can see whether you're doing it or not. It's visible to anyone. And if I put on my mask and you put on your mask, then we can walk down the street, on opposite sides of the street and not run in the other direction in abject terror. So it was a way to give terrified people who were terrified because they had been given bad information about the virus, a way to give these people some sense of agency and control. But it was also a marker of compliance and, a way to have citizens punish one another for the lack of compliance. Because with vaccines, you can't really tell if someone is vaccinated or not. That's why they wanted the vaccine passport. So you had to sort of like show and demonstrate at various checkpoints that you had been compliant. But with masks, the advantage of masks is that everyone can see immediately whether or not you're in the compliant category or you're in the category of, I don't care about killing grandma.
Before we get to the next question, I just wanted to ask you, wherever you're listening to this podcast, please take a moment and leave us a review. That would really help us out. And if you're not subscribed, go do that as well so that you don't miss out on any future conversations with us on the EDIFY podcast. Let's talk a tiny bit about the leak. Where did the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, start from? Because the U.S. Energy Department has publicly said, they released an assessment that the pandemic most likely originated from a leak within a Chinese lab and not from a wet market in China somewhere from some sick chicken or whatever it is we were told we would have to believe. Talk a little bit about that and what that means for the United States in terms of security. Was this a bioweapon that was unleashed on the American people? Was it a mistake? Why would they leak a virus? Was it done intentionally, do you think?
So I'll talk about legal terms and level of evidence in legal terms. So back when the first lab leak hypothesis was proposed in 2020, the Washington Post, ran a story, and then everything went quiet because Fauci organized a paper in the Lancet to try to downplay the lab leak theory. That paper happened to be signed by 10 people, all of whom had conflicts of interest because they were tied to gain-of-function research. But that signaled that we're not supposed to talk about this, and the media and other scientists generally complied with that. But initially, I thought we had probable cause for a lab leak theory. That's the level of evidence you need for a search warrant, right? Now, I think it's very clear that we have a preponderance of evidence. That's the level of evidence you need to win a civil case, a lawsuit. And that preponderance of evidence is moving, I think, very quickly toward beyond reasonable doubt, which is the level of evidence you need for a criminal conviction. So I think it's hard to deny that this was an engineered virus. And the only reason to engineer viruses is to make them more deadly. So gain-of-function research is bioweapons research, period. Now, defendants of gain-of-function research will say, well, there's a dual use. We can develop weapons, but we can also make things more virulent in order to try to develop countermeasures like vaccines. That's never actually worked out in practice. Let's suppose that's what they were doing at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Well, it backfired, didn't it? Right? We didn't develop a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. We developed SARS-CoV-2, and then it was unleashed on the population. So the only question remaining, and look, the forensic evidence for this has to do with the genetic code of the virus itself, a piece of the spike protein called the furin cleavage site, which has human fingerprints on it.
What do you mean by that? How would you know it has human?
It's virtually impossible for the spike protein on the virus to have evolved naturally. Okay. It's got signs of human tinkering built into it. And that has to do with the way evolutionary biologists look at genetics and look at, how fast can something evolve and what direction it can evolve and so forth. So it has sequences in there that look engineered, okay? Then, even before we look at the genetic sequencing of the virus, we have the Wuhan Institute of Virology at the place where the first outbreak started, and this is an institute, BSL-4 laboratory, which means it's doing bioweapons research. And it's doing bioweapons research specifically on, guess what? Coronaviruses. So it's like you have a smoking gun. You have a lot of forensic evidence pointing at this culprit. And then you look at the genetic code of the virus and you see, the odds of this evolving naturally are sort of like the odds of a monkey sitting down at a typewriter and knocking out a Shakespearean sonnet. So all the evidence is pointing in that direction. The only pending question remaining is whether it was deliberately or accidentally leaked. I'm agnostic on that question. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know that we're ever going to find out the answer to that question because the Chinese Communist Party did a good job of blocking the WHO and other Western nations from investigating the lab leak origins early on when the evidence would have been clearer. It's like trying to do a murder investigation after, the crime scene has been tinkered with for a couple of years.
President Biden has now said he's finally going to end the federal COVID state of emergency, but not until May of 2023. Tell me your thoughts on that. Why would he continue the state of emergency when there's clearly not been a state of emergency for some time now?
Yeah, he announced a few months ago in 60 Minutes that the pandemic was over and going into the midterms, which would have been politically advantageous for him and his party to announce going into the midterms. We had this huge problem and I've solved it under my tenure. Now it's over and, the elections are coming up. So vote for us because we're doing a great job with COVID. But his advisors immediately panicked and said, no, you can't say that. And so he backtracked. Well, why did he backtrack? Well, they knew if the pandemic is over that the state of emergency has to be sundowned. But the president himself gains 128 additional extra constitutional powers during a federal state of emergency, including access to emergency funding. So he gains power and the ability to allocate a lot of money that normally would require Congress to, Congress holds the purse strings, but there's some exceptions during a declared state of emergency. And those powers he can delegate to unelected bureaucrats like Javier Becerra, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and other individuals in public health and intelligence and military agencies that are involved in pandemic response. And, as we know, it's human nature. People are very reluctant to give up power voluntarily. Same thing, by the way, happens at state level with declared states of emergency in, California, New York, or whatever. We're still operating under a state of emergency in California, where I live, and the governor himself gains additional extra constitutional powers during a state of emergency that he's reluctant to relinquish. So there's a very serious public policy issue, which I discuss in my book, that the declared state of emergency is, first of all, what made all these bad pandemic policies possible, including the emergency use authorization process for the vaccines. And the problem with this state of emergency or state of exception is that the same federal or state level executive who declares the emergency is the one who gains the additional powers during an emergency. And he's the only one that's able to declare the emergency over. So what I argue for is we need policy changes at the state and federal level to put some constitutional checks and balances and separation of power principles in place to manage states of emergency. For example, what constitutes an emergency has never been defined in state or federal law. There's no threshold definition. And we would argue endlessly about what that threshold should be, what sort of metrics should we use. But, the democratic process of compromise, we come to some sort of definition. That could allow judicial review by the courts, right? Somebody could bring a suit saying, the COVID emergency has long been over according to the criteria defined in law in terms of, hospital overload or whatever metrics we decided to go with. And a judge could say, yeah, you're right. So the court could force the executive. Another proposal, and you could have some combination of these things as well, is some sort of legislative check on the system. So, maybe if there's an earthquake in California that devastates San Francisco, the governor needs to be able to declare a state of emergency to help manage the situation for the first 2-3 weeks, right? But then the California state legislature can get together and decide whether or not to renew that state of emergency. And they can vote on it, and they can exercise some sort of check on the executive power to, accrue and additional powers to himself that ordinarily would be reserved for the state or federal legislature. So this is a little bit of an abstract legal issue. People are, I think, more focused on critiquing specific pandemic policies, like lockdowns were a bad idea, school closures were a bad idea. Those critiques are necessary, But also we need this deeper understanding that all those things were made possible by this unilateral state of emergency issue. And we've kind of developed a new model of governance, what I call in the subtitle of my book, the Biomedical Security State model of governance, that really requires jumping from one declared emergency to the next in order to maintain those emergency powers, in order to get things done that the ordinary, slow, cumbersome political process would make much more difficult. Precisely because the will of the people has to be taken into account, and not just the will of some unelected public health bureaucrat or the president or a state governor.
You've mentioned the biomedical security state a couple of times. Is there kind of a brief working definition of that you could share?
Yeah. So my definition, which I describe in my book, The New Abnormal, is the biomedical security state is the welding together of three things that used to be distinct. The first element is an increasingly militarized public health apparatus. And I talk in the book about what I mean by militarized public health. The second element is the use of digital technologies of surveillance and control. So this is the first pandemic of the smartphone age, where we had technologies available to track people at a very micro level in terms of their movements, in terms of social distancing, things like vaccine passports. The QR code is an obvious example of that. But we know that for example, we know now that the CDC was, without the knowledge and consent of Americans, was extracting track and trace data from our phones, whether we wanted them to or not, monitoring how many people were gathering at schools, how many people were gathering at churches during lockdowns and school closures. And this data was supposedly de-identified, but some researchers at Princeton showed that with only 4 data points, you could easily trace this back to a specific individual. So that level of mass surveillance is something that we hadn't seen until COVID. So increasingly militarized public health apparatus, digital technologies of surveillance and control, all backed up by the third element, which is the police powers of the state. An example that's familiar to many people of that is Justin Trudeau in Canada, Prime Minister of Canada, invoking the Emergency Act for the first time in Canadian history, not just to forcibly remove the trucker convoy from the capital city of Ottawa, but also, with the cooperation of banks, to freeze the bank accounts of the truckers, to freeze the bank accounts of anyone who gave money to the truckers. So imagine giving $50 to the Freedom Convoy one day because you like what they stood for, peaceful protest, and the next day going to the ATM and you can't withdraw money from your checking account because the government has frozen it.
That's insane. I mean, that to me
is that the kind of society that you want to live in?
No. I mean, that's so shocking. Was there anything else equally or even more shocking that you found out when you were researching your book?
There is. I don't want to give away too many spoilers. The most concerning things are the things that are coming down the pike. And I would encourage, if anyone's interested in the book, don't skip the epilogue. The epilogue is called Seattle 2030. And it's a fictional, imaginative sort of science fiction little story. But it's not science fiction in the sense of, I didn't make up any new technologies. I took already existing technologies that have not been rolled out on a mass scale and said, these things are coming down the pike. If these things are put in place over the next few years, this is what society in your life is going to look like. Is this the kind of world that you want to live in? So a little teaser maybe for the end of the book.
You showed remarkable integrity and courage, Dr. Kheriaty, during all of this. And, and that didn't come at a small price to you. You have a large family and you did the right thing, very prayerfully, I know. And so just as we close now, what would be your advice to those who have serious pressures in the workplace like you faced?
So first of all, do an examination of conscience and ask yourself the question, how far am I willing to be pushed before I draw a line and say this far, but no further. If you don't, in principle, have some line, that's concerning because that's how totalitarian regimes come into power. They push and then they push a little more and they push a little more and they keep pushing until people wake up one day and realize that they've relinquished all of their rights in order to save their job or save their reputation or what have you. That line is going to be in a different place for different people. Not everyone is going to take the kind of stand that I took, and that's okay. People have responsibilities to their family. They have responsibilities that are unique to their particular circumstances, and so that question has to be answered on an individual level. But you should have some sort of limit, right? It may be different from where my line in the sand is. But if you have none, then I think you have to ask yourself the question, why is that? Why would I be willing to compromise deeply held principles, for the sake of professional gain or public reputation or whatever? And then the second thing I would say is connect with other people who are also concerned, because resistance is much more effective when it's collective than when it's individual.
Well, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, a joy as always to be with you. And listeners, if you want to learn a little bit more about Aaron's story, the links to his previous podcast episode, as well as his wonderful EDIFY animated video, I'll be down in the show notes below. And thanks again. It's been a joy having you.
Likewise. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. To make it easier for you to listen to future EDIFY podcast episodes, please make sure you subscribe over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thank you.